Hello again. Thank you very much for joining me here on Movie Ninja. And it is September. Already, it's September. Wow. So, what I've been doing is I've been scanning the horizon. I've been looking for horror-related films. Yes, it's September, but as soon as the candy and the decorations are in the store, it's pretty much October. Let's be honest with ourselves, all right? So, what I did was I started looking for horror films, like newer horror films. I'm going to also be doing some recommendations for some older horror films as well, just to kind of, get ready for the season. So, what I did was I saw this little movie, Jakob's Wife. And I just didn't know what to expect. I'm not really a huge horror buff. That's more like my dad. He has like tons and tons of like horror films, but I still have my favorites, and as we all do. So what it is that I looked at this, and I said I'm gonna give it a shot. So tonight I'm gonna be talking about the horror film Jakob's Wife, and with this I'm actually, to summarize in and of itself, I'm just gonna read. I'm shameless. I'm going to read off the back of the box here. So, luckily I have my reading glasses on. All right. Anne is married to a small town minister and feels like her marriage has been shrinking for the last 30 years. After a chance encounter with the master, she discovers bite marks on her neck, a new sense of power, and an appetite to live bigger and bolder than ever. I recite this a little bit camp, because there are certain... Let me just get into it. Okay, so essentially the film does a very good job of describing the monster's transformation. So what do I mean by that? There are several films where the most frightening aspect is what the character goes through. Because you just aren't, well, okay, I'm a monster. And when I say monster, I mean literal. Like mythical monster. You have your like vampires, ghosts, sometimes like mutations for like your creature features and like that. And sometimes these films go right to the transformation, and there's like not really a lot of middle ground. This film actually does what some of the better monster movies like do, in my opinion, which is really goes through the motions of the transformations. For example, two of my favorite horror films of all time, American Werewolf in London and David Cronenberg's The Fly. The stress is not necessarily entirely on how the monster eats people or is destructive and like that. Kind of like you see in the older, kind of universal, sort of like horror flicks and maybe some creature features. The horror is becoming the monster. The horror is the transformation in and of itself. So what happens with Anne is that she is living this small town life. Nothing wrong with that. A lot of us do. But unfortunately, she's having a bit of a midlife crisis. Like, she feels the weight of her routine just really burdensome and start to like weigh her down in such a way that she's almost resentful of it. I say almost. I take that back. She is resentful of it, and she's resentful of the possibility that she is unhappy with her marriage. And that being said, she's unhappy with her marriage, that she has wasted her life, that she's been dishonest with herself, and even if she has a relatively good life, she's unhappy. All of these factors compile into making her very unhappy. Unfortunately, she doesn't really see a way out of it. She's the minister's wife, and she just doesn't really have it in her to break things off. Understandable because, divorce or separation always comes with a kind of consequence, like one way or the other. And so, I mean, she doesn't, she feels like a prisoner in this, and, we see that she's kind of, at the very beginning of the film, she's slipping into a kind of temptation of sorts. She meets up with an old boyfriend of hers, and they're just meeting for drinks. There's meeting for drinks and to discuss, a business proposal for a way to renovate an old mill, an old industrial mill, somewhere on the outskirts of town. While in the outskirts of town, as the back of the box mentions, unfortunately, she is attacked by the Master. And from here, we have this really well put together transformation story. Like, she does not come out of this emotionally unscathed. The first scene right after she has like really suffered the attack, the actress Barbara Crampton does a really fine job of like expressing the trauma of someone who has suffered like some kind of assault. And at the very beginning is where she really has some really good like performances. Now, from here, yeah, as mentioned, she does undergo some type of change, and it's a rather quick and dramatic change. She's much more aggressive. She's she's experimental in a few different ways. She really undergoes like a 180 in such a way that the husband doesn't really see the writing on the wall, supernatural or otherwise. He really just thinks that his wife is acting out of sorts. So moving from the first to the second act, when we really start to, like, when this really becomes a horror film, that's when, okay, it all just comes out into the open. All the cards are laid bare on the table, and then it becomes a monster hunt. And it's a good monster hunt, for better or for worse. I really like this production company, RLJE Films. They really do a lot with a staple of horror films used to be the practical effects. It's kind of gotten away from that, like since around like the early 2000s and such. But there are some films, RLJE, XYZ, a few other like independent distributors and like that are really starting to try to bring practical effects back into horror to really showcase a kind of visceral, sort of like violent sort of atmosphere to these things. And I really like a lot of the product that they have here. But then you get into the final third of the film, and a lot of the characters' motivations get a little bit like muddy. There is this combination of this middle-aged woman, and she has a choice of, okay, you can go back to being a normal person and you can be diminutive and submissive and no one will give you a second thought, or you could remain an undead blood drinker. Two choices. Okay, what do you pick? The film, I think in a rather clumsy way in the third act, actually conflates the ideas of personal empowerment with being an undead monster. Like, there are even some points where it's kind of clear that they didn't know how to transition into the last act. There's a lot more humor in the last 30 minutes than there was in the previous parts of the film, and I don't think that was necessarily a good thing, because it seems like there's a gradual and then very sudden like tonal shift. Oh, suddenly we're mixing all this like horror and like violence and humor, and just because like, where did this come from? Not only that, but also the script suffered a bit at coming close to the end, where you just have some characters just say, oh, this is what I'm feeling now, and you never knew this before, and now I'm telling you because you never knew this before. Once again, when you're putting all your cards out on the table, yeah, sometimes it is good to speak bluntly and just speak clearly. But it felt like in certain scenes, there were just, like, this was like the character notes in the script, and they just used them in the script. Well, I feel like you have done this all these years, and you never recognize. Well, I don't feel like I've done that. Well, like, it felt a little bit too out there. It felt a little bit lacking nuance, unfortunately. But that being said, two-thirds of the film are like really solid. The transformation, that is something to really take away from this. I really like the fact that they focus on an area that a lot of vampire fiction actually doesn't focus on. Usually it's focused on younger people succumbing to temptation, younger people succumbing to the vices of like youth. You just want to live like wild and free, and of course, if you accept your independence, of course you must be a monster. So yeah, a lot of like horror films don't really like approach this particularly well, in my opinion. But in this one, I like the fact that they're focusing on, this is a middle-aged character, and they're focusing on a lot of the constraints and a lot of the fears, because like when you're going into I'm in my 30s, but I do think like sometimes like, yeah, could I have done this differently? Should I have done this? Like you do have those thoughts, and so I have no doubt that someone in their 40s through 60s, 60s is like senior, but still, like thinks to themselves like what have I done with my life? Like it. And uses that as a sort of like, uses the transformation into a vampire as a possibility of a second chance. And that, for what it is, the transformation, like in the first and like second portions of the film, actually is done fairly well, reasonably well. So even though I didn't like the ending as much, I will still say this is a solid, this is my rating. This is a solid 6 out of 10. I will say 6 out of 10. Some of you may be thinking, well, that's not too good. No, I believe a majority of people who watch this and know what they're getting into going into this, I think they will be satisfied, entertained, and while they're hey, they're gonna like this. I think that this is a very strong, newer, because I believe this came out 2020, but it's just like it's getting a release as of this year, at least like for home media, which I prefer. A lot of people don't like home media. I do. Because you can't always rely on what streaming services have. So I will give this a solid 6 out of 10. I think most people will enjoy it for what it is. It gets a little muddy. It gets a little clumsy at the very end. There's some loose ends plot-wise that are not really like tied up at all or referenced, which once again, you kind of lose a little bit of points there. But overall, respectable, decent, serviceable, well done, 6 out of 10. What about you guys? Did you see the film? Have you seen it? Do you have thoughts on it? Do you disagree? What do you think? So, this has been the Jakob's Wife review. Thank you for joining me here on Movie Ninja. I look forward to reviewing and recommending a lot of like horror-related content over the next couple of months. So, thank you guys again, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.